Is Facundo Pellistri good enough to be United's starting right winger in the long term? Definitely not. Is he good enough to even be a backup at United in the long term? Maybe not either. But should he be given a chance as United's starting right winger at the moment? 100%. And to be honest, that says a lot more about United's squad and their options in the right winger department than it does really about Pellistri. And even though I do think he will get a run of games, I think Pellistri's United career, or really his career in general, has been completely sabotaged by United's terrible development of youth. But before I go any further, remember to subscribe to the channel and check out my Patreon podcast, which will be linked below. But also, if you want cheap, good quality football jerseys for the new season, or retro jerseys from the past 40 years, then check out jerseyfifa.com, a link will be in my Instagram bio, and if you use coupon code Atlantis, you should get a discount as well. I'll leave my Instagram at the top of the description and comment section, and a link will be in my Instagram bio. Whenever I watch Pellistri play, I do think that he's very raw, but he has something about his game which excites me. And then I remember that he's 21, 22 in December, and I can't help but feel that Pellistri is a perfect example of what happens to a player when they have a complete lack of development. He plays more like an 18 or a 19-year-old than he does a 21 or a 22-year-old. And to me, when you look back through his United career, you can see exactly why. After playing 30 games as an 18-year-old for Peñarol in Uruguay, he was signed by United for around £9 million on a 5-year deal, which whilst being cheap in the grand scheme of things when you look at United's overall transfers, for an unknown player from South America, that's quite a sizable fee, and so you would expect him to eventually be a starter for United, or at least being bought with the view of being sold for a much higher fee. However, after just making 6 appearances for United's under-23s in the first half of the 2020-21 season, he was then loaned out to Alaves where he only made 12 appearances in the second half of the season. And so after failing to really nail down a starting spot at Alaves, what did United do the following season? Well, they loaned him straight back to Alaves, where he made just 21 appearances in La Liga, amounting to just 751 minutes played in the whole of that season in all competitions. And this second loan to Alaves I think is a main reason why we've seen Pellistri stagnate. But he comes back for the 22-23 season, aged 20, nearly 21, and because he wasn't loaned out, you'd assume that he had a decent role to play in Ten Hag's squad for last season. However, he featured in just 280 minutes in the whole season at United, and that includes game time for the under-23s as well. And so if United hadn't stagnated his career enough by loaning him to Alaves where he barely featured, they made it even worse by keeping him in the squad and playing him even less. And to me, I just look at this as, what is the point? I mean, surely it was obvious that he wasn't going to get the sort of game time, at least by January, so why are you keeping him for the full season? And to be fair, when I did watch him play a bit in the Europa League, I think it was against Real Betis, he did look decent. He didn't look like he was ever going to be a starter for United, but he showed some glimpses where you think the potential was there. But obviously it's hard to really analyse him just because he hasn't had enough game time. And I think this is a perfect example of how United have completely failed their youth system. You can criticise the likes of Chelsea and Manchester City as much as you want, but the one thing they know how to do is produce youth players. Even if they are just selling them, they are selling them for decent amounts. And the quality of players that are coming through Chelsea and Manchester City are just far superior to the players that United are producing. But to me, both Manchester City and Chelsea are missing out by selling on their young players rather than integrating them into their squad. And I guess it is understandable they are doing it for short-term FFP balancing, but I think if this was the case at Manchester United, it would be going against the club's philosophy. Because if we pretend that the players that City have produced in the last few years instead came through Manchester United's system, I would be more than happy to have a few of those players in United's squad for this season. I would definitely take Harwood Bellis over either Johnny Evans or Harry Maguire. Rico Lewis is already in Manchester City's squad, so he'd probably get into United's as well. I would rather have someone like Tommy Doyle over Donny van der Beek, and probably even Shea Charles over Scott McTominay. Oscar Bob does look like he has the ability to cement himself as a Manchester City squad player this season. And Cole Palmer is also someone I'd definitely take in this United squad, and I was quite surprised that City would even allow him to go to Chelsea. And to be honest, you'd have to say that Pep Guardiola's Manchester City in the 2020s are a lot more like 1990s Manchester United under Sir Alex Ferguson than this current Manchester United in 2023 are. And the production of youth is a main reason why, but also just how well run they are and how dominant they've been in the Premier League. And I'm surprised that Pep Guardiola hasn't tried to integrate more young players into this squad, as it's really only Phil Foden and Rico Lewis, and maybe now Oscar Bob, who are establishing themselves as key players in Manchester City's squad, and you'd have to say that this is what Ten Hag needs to do with the likes of Mainu and Garnacho, and as I said in a video I made a couple of weeks ago, I think Alvaro Fernandez could have been integrated into the first team setup this season, rather than being sent on loan, which was something I also said about James Garner last season, prior to him being sold to Everton for around 15 million. But it isn't even just the likes of Garner and Pellistri. I think Zidane Iqbal's another example, someone who wasn't loaned out, he spent too much time in the under-23s, and I think that really stagnated his career. He was sold for peanuts, I think it was around £850,000, but United do apparently have a 40% sell-on clause, as well as a buyback clause as well to bring him back to Old Trafford. But even still, the fact that he got to 20 years old without really being given a chance in the United first team or loaned out at all, just tells me that United really don't have any sort of plan for developing youth players, because regardless of whether you think the likes of Pellistri and Iqbal are even good enough to be at United, you cannot deny that keeping a player in the under-23s until their early 20s is a terrible move for their career. What United need to do is work out some sort of loan system for their youth players, not just keep them in the under-23s. The way I would do it is when players turn 18 or 19, or are at least developed enough for senior football, I would put them into different categories based on how I judge their careers. So you might have the top tier talents where I'd put players like Garnacho and Mainu, players who I expect to be starters for United long term. I think you then have what I would define as second tier talents, players who could definitely be starters, but I'm not as sure and it will depend on their development, but could definitely be decent squad players in the future, and I'd put players like Pellistri, Alvaro Fernandez, Medjbury, and even someone like James Garner who was sold last summer. I'd put them all in that category as well. And then you have what I would call the mid-level talents, of players who are unlikely to be in United's squad, even in the short term, but definitely not in the long term, but players who you want to build up, develop to a decent level, and then sell them on for as much as possible. And I'd put players like Brandon Williams, Zidane Iqbal, Ethan Laird, and maybe Tenin Mengi as well, all in this category. For the mid-level talents, when they get to maybe 18 or 19, you need to be looking at moving them on loan for at least 2 years in order to develop properly. Personally, I think United should start utilising the MLS for players who are maybe technically gifted but maybe don't have the kind of physicality that's needed to thrive in the Championship or in League One. The other reason why I personally really like the MLS for developing players is because firstly, it's a very open league. Unlike maybe the Championship or League One, where you're going to have teams who sit deep and compact, the MLS seems to be very end-to-end, a lot of spaces for players to take advantage of, and I think that's a perfect environment for young players to develop. If we look at someone like Pellistri, for example, you probably don't want him playing on the right side of a midfield four for, say, Birmingham in the Championship, where he's going to have to do a lot of defensive work. The play is very direct, and so it's going to be a lot of running up and down. He's not going to be in a possession-based side. Whereas if you go to the MLS, you do have these sides who want to play attractive football, play out from the back. And also, if you were to put Pellistri into an MLS team, whilst he may not be the best player in the league with the amount of talent that the MLS has managed to bring to the league, he would definitely be a key player, even if he was sent on loan maybe at 18 or probably 19. And so not only would 18, 19-year-old Pellistri have got more game time in the MLS, but most probably he would also be playing in a system and in a league that is definitely more accustomed to playing attacking creative football compared to the Championship or League One. And so for the mid-level talents, which I probably would have considered Pellistri when he was 18 or 19, he can do a season or so in the MLS, develop his confidence, and then come back to United and go on loan maybe to the Eredivisie, or even to La Liga, and he would have had a year behind him, and I think he would have thrived a lot better if he had made the move to the MLS on loan before going to Alaves, and it would have helped him establish himself in the Alaves side, which ultimately would have then benefited him more when he comes back to United, because he would have had a lot more games and a lot more experience under his belt. Unfortunately, United haven't done that, and it has stagnated Pellistri's career, but hopefully this season will be the revival of his career.